Her own family sold her to the circus for being too tall and dark, until the quiet black strongman paid her price and brought her home. They called the place Professor Phileas's Menagerie of the Strange and Unearthly, but it was just a dirt lot on the edge of a town that had already seen better days. The dust was the first thing you noticed. It was a character all its own, a fine red powder that got in your throat and your eyes and settled on your skin like a second grimy layer. It tasted of grit and animal sweat and despair. She sat in a cage made of rusted iron bars, a cage meant for a bear or a lion, but she was neither. She was just a girl who had grown too fast and too tall, whose skin drank the sun until it was the color of rich, dark soil. Her own pa, he'd been the one to sign the paper. He couldn't even look at her when he did it. Just stared at the shiny silver dollars the professor pushed across the splintered table. Coins that winked in the lantern light like little betrayals. Her ma had just wept, a quiet, useless sound that did nothing to stop the rope from being tied around her wrists. An affliction, her pa had muttered to the neighbors, his voice thick with shame and cheap liquor. Too much of a giant to find a husband. Too dark to be our own. So they sold her. For a handful of silver and the promise that she'd be fed. They didn't ask what kind of food, or what she'd have to do to earn it. The cage was her world now. The floor was packed earth, cold and damp, littered with old straw that smelled sour. By day, the sun beat down on the canvas tent, turning the air thick and suffocating. People would pay a nickel to come and stare. They'd poke sticks through the bars, not to hurt, just to see if she was real. Their faces were a blur of gaping mouths and cruel curiosity. The children were the worst. They'd point and shriek with a kind of fearful delight. "Look, Mama, the giant negress, is she a cannibal?" And the mothers would pull them back with a shiver, a little thrill of disgust. She learned to make herself small as a girl of 6.5 feet could be. She'd huddle in the corner, her long limbs drawn in, her head bowed so her curtain of thick black hair hid her face. Silence was her only shield. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't make a sound. She just endured. The silence was a language. It said everything she couldn't. It spoke of the ache in her joints, the constant gnawing hunger in her belly, the splinter of shame that had lodged itself deep in her heart. The pain was a constant companion, not just the physical pain of the cramped space and the meager rations, but the other kind, the kind that came from the whispers. Unnatural, creature, thing. The words were stones they threw at her, and even if they didn't break bones, they bruised something deeper. At night, after the crowds were gone, the silence changed. It became heavier, filled with the snores of the roustabouts, the chuffing of the sad old lion in the next wagon, the distant sound of a harmonica playing a lonesome tune. That's when she would let herself feel it. The raw, hot rage at her family, the cold terror of the unknown. She'd trace the patterns of the rust on the bars with her finger, feeling the rough texture under her skin. It felt like her life, corroded, ugly, and trapping her in. The professor would sometimes bring her food himself, a tin plate with a heel of stale bread and a lump of greasy, cold stew. He'd slide it through a slot at the bottom of the cage, his eyes never quite meeting hers. He saw a commodity, an investment. His talk was all business. "Gotta fatten you up a bit, girl," he'd say, his voice slick. "People pay to see a giant, not a skeleton." He never used her name. He didn't know it. He didn't care. He called her Shadow, or Goliath, or whatever name would look good on a painted sign. She was an object, a curiosity to be bought and sold and stared at. The raw injustice of it all was a fire in her gut. She had been born. She had lived. She had a name her mother had given her. But none of that mattered here. Here, she was only what they said she was. Too tall, too dark, a thing in a cage. And in the suffocating silence of that traveling circus, under a blanket of red dust, it felt like that was all she would ever be. The world had shrunk to the size of her prison, and hope was a foreign country she'd only heard rumors about. I've been telling this story for a little bit now, and I gotta ask, where are you all watching this from? It's always fascinating to see how far these tales travel. Go on and drop your city, state, or country in the comments down below. And if you're finding yourself pulled into this world, if you're enjoying the story so far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It lets me know you're out there listening. Now let's get back to it. Into this dusty, hopeless world walked a man who was as quiet as she was. He was part of the circus, but not one of them. Not really. He was the strong man. They called him Silas. He wasn't a performer in the flashy sense. He was a worker. He lifted the heavy tent poles, loaded the wagons, and did the back-breaking labor that nobody else could or would. He was a mountain of a man, with skin the color of polished mahogany and muscles that coiled and uncoiled under his worn shirt like sleeping serpents. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that seemed to defy his size. He didn't talk much. In a place filled with the constant chatter of barkers and performers, his silence was a stark contrast. It wasn't a timid silence. It was a heavy, solid thing. The other men gave him a wide berth. They respected his strength but were unnerved by his quiet intensity. He saw her on his first day. He was hauling a crate of supplies past her cage when he stopped. He didn't stare like the others. He didn't gawk or whisper. He just looked. His eyes, dark and deep-set, held a flicker of something she hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, as if he was looking past the cage, past the dirt, and seeing the person huddled inside. He stood there for a long moment, the sun beating down on his broad back. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod and walked away. He didn't speak a word to her, but that look, that small gesture, was the first crack in the wall of her despair. He started leaving things for her. A piece of fruit pilfered from the cook's tent, a clean rag left hanging on a bar of her cage. Once, a small, wild daisy he must have picked from the side of the road. He never did it when anyone was looking. He'd pass by on some errand, and with a movement so quick and subtle it was almost invisible, he would leave his small offering. They were simple, practical things, but to her, they were acts of rebellion. They were proof that someone saw her as a human being. A few weeks passed like this. The silent exchanges, the fleeting moments of connection. Then one evening, the professor was in a foul mood. The crowds had been thin, and he'd been drinking. He stormed over to her cage, his face flushed and his breath smelling of whiskey. "You're not earning your keep, you lazy thing," he slurred, rattling the bars. "Tomorrow you're gonna do a little dance for them, a little jig to make the children laugh." He leered at her, his eyes ugly. "We'll see if that brings in the nickels." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. The thought of being forced to perform, to debase herself for their amusement, was more terrifying than the cage itself. Just then, Silas rounded the corner of the wagon. He stopped when he saw the professor. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his presence filling the space. The professor, emboldened by drink, sneered at him. "What are you looking at, boy? Get back to work." Silas's gaze didn't waver. It shifted from the professor to her, huddled in the cage, then back to the professor. His voice, when it finally came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "How much?" The professor blinked, confused. "How much for what?" "Her," Silas said, his voice flat. He gave a short, sharp jerk of his chin towards the cage. A laugh burst out of the professor, a wet, ugly sound. "She ain't for sale. She's my main attraction." "Everything's for sale," Silas said. His eyes were hard. "Name a price." The professor's greedy little mind started working. He looked at the massive man before him, then at the girl in the cage. He saw an opportunity. He named a price that was absurd, a price that was more than a man like Silas could possibly make in a year of back-breaking labor. He named it with a smirk, expecting to be laughed at. Silas didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt, a pouch she had never seen him open before. He pulled out a heavy roll of bills, bound with a piece of twine. He counted out the money, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he pulled out a handful of silver coins, some gold ones too, things he must have saved for a lifetime. He laid the entire sum on a nearby crate. It was a fortune, a king's ransom in this dusty, forgotten place. The professor stared at the money, his jaw slack. He couldn't believe his eyes. You've been holding out on me," he stammered. Silas ignored him. He looked at the professor, his gaze like a physical weight. "Get the key." The professor, stunned into obedience, fumbled for the ring of keys at his belt. He unlocked the cage door, his hands shaking. The lock made a loud, grating sound as it turned. Silas pushed the heavy iron door open. It swung wide with a long, mournful creak. He looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. He just stood back, giving her space. "Come on," he said, his voice still that low rumble. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. For the first time in months, she stood up to her full height, her head nearly brushing the top of the cage. She stepped out, her legs unsteady beneath her, out into the dusty air, a free woman. She didn't look back. The walk from the circus was silent. He didn't try to make conversation, and she was grateful for it. Words felt foreign in her mouth, like pebbles she'd have to spit out. He walked just ahead of her, his broad back a shield against the world. His home wasn't a house, but a small, sturdy cabin on the edge of the woods, far enough from the town that you couldn't hear its noise. It was rough-hewn, made of logs he'd likely cut and placed himself. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the darkening sky. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A single room with a packed earth floor, a stone fireplace, a narrow cot in one corner, and a rough wooden table with 2 stools. A stack of firewood was piled neatly by the hearth. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and clean earth. It was the safest place she had been in a year. He gestured to one of the stools. "Sit." She sat. Her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep. He moved around the small space with an economy of motion, stoking the fire until it crackled to life, filling a blackened pot with water from a bucket by the door. He didn't fuss over her. He didn't ask questions. He just acted. He took a hunk of salted pork and some dried beans and dropped them into the pot, setting it on a hook over the fire to simmer. The smell of the food, simple as it was, made her stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was painful. While the stew cooked, he went to a wooden chest in the corner and took out a clean rag and a small jar of some kind of salve. He placed them on the table in front of her, along with a bucket of warm water he'd heated by the fire. He didn't say what they were for. He didn't have to. He just looked at her wrists, still red and raw from the rope, and then at the bucket. Then he turned his back, giving her privacy as he busied himself by the fire. Her hands trembled as she dipped the rag into the warm water. The simple act of cleaning her own skin felt like a sacred ritual. The dirt and grime of the circus washed away, revealing the pale, chafed skin underneath. She opened the jar of salve. It smelled of pine and something medicinal. She carefully smoothed the grease over the raw places, the cool balm, a welcome relief. She wasn't just cleaning a wound. She was erasing a mark of her captivity. She was reclaiming a small piece of herself. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls. He placed one in front of her, along with a spoon. He sat on the other stool and began to eat, his focus entirely on his food. He ate like he did everything else, with a quiet, deliberate intensity. She watched him for a moment, then looked down at the steam rising from her own bowl. She picked up the spoon. The first mouthful was hot and salty, and the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was more than just food. It was nourishment, it was safety. It was a gesture of care so profound in its simplicity that it brought tears to her eyes. She ate slowly, making the meal last, savoring every spoonful. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of their spoons against the wooden bowls. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable one, a silence that didn't need to be filled. After they finished, he took the bowls, washed them in the bucket, and set them aside to dry. He pointed to the cot. "You sleep there." He took a thick horse blanket from the chest and laid it on the floor for himself near the fire. There was no discussion, no debate. It was a simple, practical arrangement. She lay down on the cot, pulling a rough wool blanket over herself. It was lumpy and smelled faintly of him, of wood smoke and clean sweat. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was in a real bed, in a real room, with a locked door and a protector sleeping just a few feet away. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of his steady breathing and the pop and hiss of the fire. The ghosts of the circus, the jeering faces and cruel whispers, seemed far away, held at bay by the solid walls of the cabin and the presence of the quiet man on the floor. In this simple shelter, through the ritual of a shared meal and the unspoken offering of safety, a fragile seed of trust had been planted in the barren ground of her heart. A few days passed in a quiet rhythm. He would rise before the sun, chop wood, and tend to his snares. She would sweep the cabin, fetch water from the creek, and try to make herself useful. They rarely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures and a shared understanding of the tasks that needed to be done. The silence was a space where things could grow. One afternoon, she followed him as he went to check his traps. He moved through the woods with a hunter's grace, his feet making no sound on the carpet of pine needles. He stopped at a small clearing at the edge of his property. In the center of the clearing were two small mounds of earth, marked with simple, hand-carved wooden crosses. They were graves. He knelt beside one of them, his large hands gently pulling away a few weeds that had sprouted. He didn't say anything. He just knelt there for a long time, his shoulders slumped, his usual strength seeming to seep out of him into the earth. She stood back, a respectful distance away, feeling like an intruder on a private sorrow. He had his own ghosts. She had assumed his quietness was just his nature, but now she saw it was a wall built around a deep and abiding pain. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, the words just started coming out of her. It wasn't a decision. It was more like a dam breaking. The pressure of all the unspoken things had built up until it had to be released. "My pa," she began, her voice hoarse from disuse. "He never wanted a girl. He wanted a son to help him on the farm. When I was born, he said I was a disappointment, and then I started growing." She stared into the flames, her hands twisting in her lap. "I just kept getting taller than him by the time I was 14. The other kids, they called me names. Beanpole, monster. My ma, she tried to protect me. She'd say I was special. A daughter of the sun and the earth, she'd call me. But then she got sick. The fever took her in a week." Silas didn't look at her. He just kept staring into the fire, his face unreadable, but she could feel him listening. "After she was gone, there was no one to stand up for me. My pa started drinking more. He said my size, my darkness, it was a curse on the family. Said it's why the crops failed one year, why the cow went dry. It was always my fault." Her voice was flat, recounting the facts without emotion. The emotion was a deep, cold well she was afraid to fall into. "The man from the circus came through town. He saw me in the market. He talked to my pa, offered him money, more money than my pa had ever seen. He told me he was sending me somewhere I'd be appreciated, where my size would be a gift." A dry, humorless laugh escaped her. "He lied. He sold me for $200 silver and a bottle of whiskey. I saw the money. He counted it right in front of me." She finally fell silent. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire. She expected him to say something, to offer some empty words of comfort. But he didn't. He just sat there, absorbing her story into his own vast silence. After a long moment he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "My wife," he said, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "Her name was Alara, and we had a boy, Samuel." He paused, and she could hear the effort it took for him to say the names out loud. "There was a sickness came through the town we were in. Took them both in the same week." He picked up a small piece of wood and threw it into the fire, watching the sparks fly up. "They said it was bad blood. Said folks like us brought the sickness. Burned our cabin down after we buried them. Said they was cleansing the land." He didn't need to explain who they were. She knew. "I left that night. Ain't never stayed in one place too long since. Nothing to stay for." He finally looked at her, his eyes holding the same deep sorrow she had seen at the graveside. "People, they get scared of what they don't understand. They give it a bad name, and then they try to destroy it." It wasn't a speech. It was a confession. A blunt, unvarnished piece of his own broken past. In that moment, the space between them filled with a new understanding. They were two different people, with two different stories of loss and betrayal, but their pain spoke the same language. They were both survivors of a world that had tried to name them, cage them, and burn them out. The fragile peace of their shared solitude was shattered a week later. The rains came first, a relentless driving downpour that turned the ground to mud and swelled the creek to a raging torrent. The storm felt like a bad omen, the sky weeping for what was to come. Then they arrived. 3 men from the town, led by a burly, red-faced man named Jedediah, the same man who'd sneered at Silas in the circus. They had been drinking, and their courage was liquid and loud. They rode up to the cabin, their horses churning the mud. their voices cutting through the sound of the rain. "Silas, we know you're in there." Jedediah's voice was a belligerent shout. "Heard you bought the circus freak. The town council ain't happy about you keeping that thing so close to decent folk." Silas was on his feet in an instant. He didn't look scared. He looked angry, a slow-burning, dangerous anger that tightened the muscles in his jaw. He moved to the door, motioning for her to stay back, to get away from the single window. She didn't listen. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight solid and reassuring in her hands. She stood in the shadows behind him, ready, a silent partner in whatever was about to happen. "Go away, Jed." Silas's voice was low, a warning growl. "This ain't your business." "It is our business," another man shouted, his voice high and nervous. "That thing ain't natural. We don't want it here." Crash. A rock smashed through the small window, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. The cold, wet wind blew in. She flinched, but didn't move. Her grip on the poker tightened. That was it. Silas yanked the door open. He stood on the threshold, filling the entire frame, a dark, immovable silhouette against the firelight within. Rain plastered his shirt to his body, outlining the raw power of his form. "Last chance," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Right away now." Jedediah laughed, a nervous, cackling sound. He dismounted, swaying slightly. "Or what, Silas? You gonna lift a heavy rock at us?" He took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a large hunting knife at his belt. "We're here to take the creature. We'll take it back to the circus, or we'll run it out of the county ourselves." Silas didn't move. He just watched Jedediah approach. The air was thick with violence. Rain. Mud. The smell of whiskey. The glint of steel. Then Jedediah lunged. It happened fast. Not a brawl, but a blunt physical statement. Silas met the lunge not with a fist, but with his whole body. A wall of muscle. He caught Jedediah's knife hand, his grip like a vice. There was a sharp crack of bone. Jedediah screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise. The knife clattered into the mud. Silas didn't stop. He grabbed the front of Jedediah's shirt, lifted the burly man clean off his feet and threw him backward. Jedediah landed with a wet, heavy thud in the mud, the air rushing out of him in a whoosh. The other two men, their drunken courage evaporating in an instant, just stared, their faces pale in the gloom. They had heard stories of the strong man's power, but seeing it was something else entirely. It was terrifying. Silas took a step out into the rain, towards them. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked. Each step was a threat. His eyes were fixed on them, burning with a cold fire. They scrambled back onto their horses, pulling a groaning Jedediah up with them. They kicked their mounts into a panicked gallop, slipping and sliding in the mud, fleeing into the stormy darkness as if the devil himself were on their heels. Silas stood in the rain for a long moment, watching them go, his chest heaving. He was a force of nature, as untamable as the storm raging around them. He finally turned and came back inside, dripping water onto the floor. He shut the door, the sound final and absolute. He looked at her, then at the poker in her hands. He saw she hadn't cowered. She had been ready to fight alongside him. A new look passed between them. It was the understanding of soldiers who have faced battle together, a raw, survivalist unity forged in the face of a common enemy. He had protected his home, and she realized with a startling clarity that for the first time in her life, she had a home to protect. The days after the confrontation with the townsmen were different. The quiet between them was no longer just about a lack of words. It was filled with an unspoken alliance. They had faced a threat together, and something had shifted, settled into place. A raw, elemental trust had taken root. They didn't talk about what happened. There was no need. The memory of it lived in the space they shared, in the way he would glance at the repaired window, in the way she kept the iron poker close to the hearth. The bond between them deepened not through conversation, but through the small, silent gestures of a shared life. One morning, he was splitting logs for the winter, a task he performed with a rhythmic, powerful grace. The axe rose and fell, and the wood gave way with a satisfying crack. He swung a little too wide, the wet axe handle slipping in his grasp. The blade glanced off the log and bit deep into his calf. A dark line of red bloomed instantly against his trousers. He swore, a low, guttural sound of pain and frustration, and sank to the ground, leaning against the woodpile. She was there in a heartbeat. She had seen it happen from the cabin door. She ran out, her heart pounding. There was no panic in her, only a sharp, clear focus. "Stay put," she said, her voice steady. Might have been the first command she had ever given him. He just grunted, his face pale, his jaw tight against the pain. She rushed back inside, grabbing the bucket of clean water, the rags, and the medicinal salve. She also grabbed a needle and the thick thread they used for mending sacks. When she returned, she knelt in the dirt beside him without hesitation. "This is gonna hurt," she said, her voice still calm and practical. He just nodded, his eyes closed. With steady hands, she tore his trouser leg to get to the wound. It was deep, bleeding freely. She pressed a clean rag against it, applying firm pressure until the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. Her touch was sure, her movements efficient. She had tended to animals on her father's farm, set a broken wing on a bird. She knew what to do. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the water, her long fingers surprisingly gentle. Then she threaded the needle. She didn't look at him for permission. She just started stitching the gash closed, her movements quick and precise. Each pull of the needle made him flinch, his whole body tensing, but he didn't make a sound. He just breathed through the pain, a series of long, controlled hisses. She was a pillar of calm, her focus absolute. It was as if all the years of being forced into stillness and silence had honed her ability to act with deliberate purpose when it mattered most. When she was done, she smoothed the pine salve over the rough stitches and wrapped the wound tightly with a clean strip of cloth. She worked in silence, her breath mingling with his in the cool morning air. He was the stone, the mountain, but in that moment, he was wounded, vulnerable, and she, the river, had risen to protect him. When she finally sat back on her heels, her work finished, he opened his eyes. He looked at the neatly bandaged wound, then he looked at her. His gaze was heavy with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than gratitude, it was respect, awe even. He reached out, his large calloused hand covering hers for just a moment. His touch was warm and solid. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an acknowledgement, a silent thank you that said more than words ever could. "You're good at that," he rumbled, his voice rough. "Had to be," she replied simply. In that shared moment of struggle and care, their connection solidified. He had rescued her from a cage of iron, and now she had rescued him from his own moment of weakness. They were two solitary beings, two halves of a whole, who had found in each other a fierce and unspoken loyalty. They were equals, protectors, survivors. The quiet strong man and the tall silent woman who knew how to stitch a wound closed. The incident with Jedediah and his men didn't just go away. It festered. When Silas's leg was healed enough for them to travel, they had to go to town for supplies. Flour, salt, lamp oil, the necessities of life. The moment they walked down the dusty main street, they could feel it. The air grew thick with hostility. Every window seemed to have a face in it. Every doorway held a silent observer. It was like walking through a gauntlet of unseen eyes. The whispers started immediately, slithering out from behind cupped hands and from the shadowy interiors of the shops. "There he is, the one who broke Jed's arm. And look, he's got that creature with him. Shameless is what it is. She's a bad omen, I tell you. Nothing but trouble since she showed up." The words were crude and sharp, meant to be overheard. They were little barbs of poison, designed to isolate and intimidate. She felt her shoulders hunch, the old instinct to make herself small, to disappear, rising up. She pulled her hair forward, trying to hide her face. But then she felt a presence at her side. Silas. He hadn't said a word, but he had slowed his pace slightly to walk shoulder to shoulder with her. A small, almost imperceptible shift, but it was a deliberate act of solidarity, a public declaration. "We are together." His face was a mask of indifference carved from stone. He seemed not to hear the whispers, not to see the glares. He walked with his head held high, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if the entire town and its petty judgments were nothing more than an inconvenient swarm of flies. They entered the general store. The chatter inside died instantly. The storekeeper, a balding man with shifty eyes named Miller, was measuring out sugar for a woman at the counter. The woman saw them, gasped, grabbed her half-filled bag and scurried out of the store without paying. Miller's face soured. Silas walked to the counter and placed a small, neat list on the wood. He didn't speak. He just waited. Miller looked at the list, then at Silas. Then his gaze slid over to her, filled with a mixture of fear and contempt. "I can serve you," Miller said, his voice tight, pointedly addressing only Silas. "But I can't have that in my store. It's bad for business, frightening the customers." He wouldn't even look at her directly. Referring to her as if she were a stray dog he wanted to shoo out the door. The air crackled with tension. She could feel the stares of the few remaining customers burning into her back. She felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks. She expected Silas to argue, to defend her, but he didn't. His response was quieter and far more powerful. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply reached out, picked up his list from the counter, and turned to her. He waited for her to walk out the door ahead of him. Then he followed, leaving the storekeeper standing there with his mouth open. They walked out of the store and down the street, leaving their much-needed supplies behind. His action was a blunt shutdown. It was a statement clearer than any speech. If she is not welcome, then neither am I. My business is her business. We are a unit. Outside, he didn't apologize or try to explain. He just started walking towards the edge of town. They would do without the flour. They would make do with what they had. It was a hard choice, but it was a choice he made for her, for them. As they left the town behind, the weight of the hostile stares and ugly whispers began to lift. She straightened her shoulders. She pushed her hair back from her face. She walked beside him, matching his long strides. He had not fought their battle with his fists this time, but with his dignity. And in doing so, he had given her back a piece of her own. The quiet defiance in the general store was a turning point. It was one thing to defend their home from a drunken mob in the dead of night. It was another to publicly align himself with her in the clear light of day, at a cost to himself. The tension that had been simmering in the town finally boiled over. A few days later, they were by the creek. She was washing their clothes against a smooth, flat rock, and he was reinforcing the small footbridge he'd built across it. The work was peaceful, the sounds of the water and the woods a balm after the ugliness of the town. But the peace was an illusion. 4 men appeared on the far bank. It was Jedediah, his arm in a dirty sling, his face twisted with malice. With him were Miller, the storekeeper, and 2 other grim-faced townsmen. They weren't drunk this time. They were sober, and that made them more dangerous. They carried pitchforks and heavy clubs. This wasn't a drunken harassment. It was a calculated act of intimidation. "Silas!" Jedediah yelled, his voice carrying across the water. "We gave you a chance to get rid of the witch. You didn't listen." Silas straightened up slowly, the hammer he was using still in his hand. He placed himself between her and the men, a living shield. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "You're trespassing. This is God's country," Miller shot back, his voice shrill with self-righteousness. "And we're here to cleanse it of your filth. That giantess has brought a curse on us. My business is failing, the crops are withering, it's her fault." She froze, the wet shirt in her hands dripping into the creek. The old words, the words her father had used. A curse. It was happening all over again. The men started to cross the footbridge one by one, their boots thudding on the wooden planks. They were closing in. Their faces were hard with a kind of righteous fury that left no room for reason. Silas had made a silent vow to himself long ago, after the fire that took his family and his home. A vow of non-involvement. He would keep to himself, harm no one, and expect the same in return. He would be a ghost, passing through the world without leaving a mark. He had broken that vow when he bought her. He had bent it when he threw Jedediah in the mud. Now these men were forcing him to shatter it completely. He looked at her, saw the flicker of old, deep-seated fear in her eyes, the fear of a child being blamed for things she couldn't control, and something inside him snapped. The quiet, contained man disappeared. In his place was pure, protective rage. He didn't wait for them to make the first move. He met them in the middle of the bridge. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He didn't use the hammer as a weapon. He dropped it. He used his body, his hands. The first man, one of Jedediah's cronies, swung a club. Silas caught the man's wrist, twisted it, and used the man's own momentum to send him stumbling off the narrow bridge and into the shallow, rocky creek below, with a splash and a cry of pain. Miller, the storekeeper, hesitated, his courage failing him. Silas grabbed him by the front of his shirt, his knuckles brushing the man's chin. He didn't hit him. He just held him there, inches from his face, his eyes blazing. "She has done nothing," he growled, each word a piece of granite. He shoved Miller back so hard he stumbled and fell on the bank. That left Jedediah. He came at Silas, brandishing his pitchfork like a spear. Silas sidestepped the clumsy thrust, grabbed the wooden handle, and ripped it from Jedediah's grasp with a single powerful wrench. He snapped the thick handle over his knee as if it were a twig. The sharp crack echoed in the sudden silence. He threw the 2 pieces of wood into the creek. Then he advanced on Jedediah, who was now unarmed and backing away, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Silas backed him right off the bridge and onto the bank. He stood over him, his shadow falling across the smaller man. "You will never come near her again," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying promise. "You will not speak her name. You will not even look in her direction. If I hear one more whisper, if I see one more sideways glance, I will come for you. And I will finish what I started." He didn't need to shout. The threat was absolute. He had crossed a line. He had publicly, physically, and unequivocally declared her as his own to protect. He was no longer a quiet loner avoiding the world. He was a guardian. He had drawn a line in the dirt around her, and he had dared the whole world to cross it. They walked back to the cabin in a charged silence. The violence at the creek had left an invisible hum in the air, a tension that was both frightening and liberating. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her safety as his own responsibility, breaking his own code to do it. The balance between them had shifted forever. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken things. He went to the fireplace and began to stack the wood he'd chopped earlier, his movements stiff and jerky. He was wrestling with what he had done, with the man he had been forced to become. She watched him, her heart a tangled knot of fear, gratitude, and a new, fragile tenderness. He had unleashed a storm for her, and now he was trying to find his own calm center again. The silence stretched on, heavier than any they had shared before. It needed to be broken, but she didn't know what words could possibly fit the magnitude of what had just happened. So she started with the only thing that felt real, the only thing that was truly hers. "They called me Shadow at the circus," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. He stopped what he was doing but didn't turn around. His broad back was to her. "Before that, at home, after my ma died, they just called me Girl, or You, like they couldn't be bothered to use a name." She took a breath, the confession feeling like letting go of a heavy stone she'd been carrying for years. "They wanted me to be invisible, to take up less space. My name, it felt too big, too much for them." He still didn't move, but she knew he was listening. Every line of his body was taut with attention. This was more important than the fight at the creek. This was the real battle, the one for a person's soul. "My mother," she continued, her voice growing a little stronger, "she gave me a name, a real one. She used to whisper it to me at night when my pa was asleep. She said it meant grace and immortal. She said it was a name for a queen." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "It never felt like it fit. Not then." She paused, gathering all her courage. She was about to hand him the most vulnerable part of herself, the one piece of her identity that hadn't been twisted or sold or put in a cage. "My name is Amara." The name hung in the air between them. Amara, it felt strange and powerful to say it out loud in this small, safe room. It felt like claiming herself. Silas finally turned around. He looked at her, really looked at her. His eyes were no longer filled with the storm of the fight, but with a deep, quiet intensity. He had fought for the nameless creature, for the giantess. Now he was face to face with the person inside. He walked over to the table and sat down, his movements slow, as if he were handling something precious and breakable. He looked at her, and for the first time, a hint of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight softening of his usually stoic features, but it transformed his face. He said the name, his voice a low, soft rumble that was nothing like the growl he'd used on Jedediah. "Amara." He said it like a discovery, like a prayer. He tasted the syllables, giving the name a weight and a reality it had never had before. It wasn't the name of a freak or a curse. It was the name of the woman standing before him. The woman who knew how to stitch a wound. The woman who had stood behind him with an iron poker, ready to fight. In that moment, by speaking her name with respect and gentleness, he gave it back to her, polished and new. And for the first time, Amara felt like it might, just might, be a name she could grow into. The next morning, the air felt different, cleansed. The saying of her name, Amara, had been a quiet revolution. It had redrawn the map of their small world. He was no longer just Silas the strong man, and she was no longer just the woman he'd rescued. They were Silas and Amara. The names had given them a foundation. After their simple breakfast, Silas did something she didn't expect. He didn't pick up his axe to chop wood or head out to check his snares. Instead, he went to a dusty corner of the cabin and pulled out a small, lopsided wooden crate. Inside was a collection of things he must have carried with him for a long time. A few worn tools, a whetstone, and at the very bottom, a small cloth sack. He brought the sack to the table and emptied its contents. Seeds, a handful of dark, wrinkled bean seeds, some pale, flat squash seeds, and a tiny packet of paper folded around something even smaller. He handled them with a reverence that surprised her. These weren't just seeds, they were a promise, a future he had kept tucked away. He looked at her, then gestured with his head toward the door. "Come on." He led her not to the woods, but to a small, sun-drenched patch of ground behind the cabin. The soil was rocky and overgrown with weeds, but it was a space that caught the morning light. It was a place where things could grow. For an hour, they worked in a comfortable, productive silence. He used a shovel to break up the hard-packed earth, his powerful muscles making the difficult work look easy. He pulled out the larger rocks and tossed them aside, building a small, protective wall around the plot. She followed behind him, her long fingers perfect for the task of pulling the stubborn weeds and breaking up the clumps of dirt, crumbling the soil until it was fine and dark. Her hands, which people had once pointed at for being too large, were now tools of creation. They were not fighting a battle against men, but were engaged in a gentle negotiation with the earth. When the small patch of land was cleared and ready, he took the sack of bean seeds and poured half of them into her open palm. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his eyes telling her that this was her land too, her garden. Side by side, they knelt in the dirt. He showed her how to press a single seed into the soil, how deep to make the hole, how to cover it gently. Together, they planted the beans and then the squash. Finally, he opened the small paper packet. Inside were tiny, almost microscopic flower seeds, wild flowers. He let her be the one to scatter them along the edge of the plot. As she let the seeds fall from her fingers, a sense of belonging so profound it almost made her dizzy, washed over her. She was putting down roots. Literally. This wasn't her father's farm, where she was a curse. This wasn't the circus, where she was a spectacle. This was a small patch of earth that she was nurturing with her own hands, alongside a man who saw her, who knew her name, who had fought for her right to simply exist. When they were done, they stood up, their hands and knees covered in rich, dark soil. They looked at the small, tilled garden, a tiny square of hope carved out of the wilderness. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. It was a silent, shared promise of a future, a testament to the fact that even in the rockiest ground, after the most violent of storms, something new and beautiful could be planted. Something that, with a little sun and a little water and a lot of care, might just grow. Thank you for joining us on this journey with Silas and Amara. If their story moved you, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel out. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. We'll see you in the next one.